Moved out of their homes in the inner suburb of Redfern, where firemen at this moment are battling 3 fires around a blazing furniture warehouse. The spectacular blaze erupted shortly before 4 o'clock and spread to 2 other buildings.
The 000 call went out just after 4 o'clock. These pictures were shot from the Eyewitness News helicopter soon after the blaze started. In a matter of minutes, the factory was engulfed in a huge fireball visible from the city outskirts. At the height of the inferno, flames were shooting as high as a 25-storey building nearby. As fleets of fire trucks, ambulances and police vehicles raced to the scene, nearby residents were quickly evacuated from their homes, the incredible heat threatening to ignite surrounding buildings. One report said 2 people had been seen trapped inside the factory. An hour after the fire began, this was still to be confirmed. Meanwhile, police quickly cordoned off surrounding streets as hundreds of people flocked to watch the spectacular. At about 5 o'clock, a second fire broke out nearby in Phillip Street near the Forster Hospital. That blaze was soon contained after patients had been evacuated. Then a third blaze, this time in Phillip Street on the 9th floor of a block of flats. The spot fires were threatening disaster everywhere. Fire crews were being pushed to their limit to control the situation.
And Peter McCarthy is on the scene with our live eye cameras. Peter, what's the latest?
Well, Anne, those separate fires have now virtually become one big fire. The furniture warehouse is no more. It's been burnt completely to the ground. There's an adjoining building next door, which police and firemen don't know what it did contain, but there were several explosions as the fire raced through it. It was several stories, and it's now been razed, and the fire is now threatening the Forster Hospital. And rescue workers and firemen can't get close enough to see, but there is some thought that it has already caught fire on the Forster.
Peter, Robert mentioned there could have been 2 people trapped in the warehouse. Have you heard anything on that?
No, that report hasn't been corroborated yet, Tim. A spokesman for the furniture company I spoke to earlier said that as far as he was aware, all people got out of the furniture complex. There were about 40 patients at the Forster Hospital evacuated, so all people out of there safely. The only area of uncertainty is this building between the furniture complex and the hospital. No one knows what it was, or at least they haven't told us yet, and no one knows how many people, if any, were inside there.
Had a chance to talk to anyone about how long it will take them to bring it all under control?
It's going to take them all night. This thing will still be going tomorrow morning. Even as we speak, people are being pushed further and further back. It's basically a case of the firemen just having to continuously retreat. They haven't a chance of putting this out. There's a stiff breeze coming up now, which is whipping the flames, and it's almost like a giant fire extinguisher. You can see in the background the orange sky and the building silhouetted against the sky. As close as we can get is about 100 metres. Police aren't letting anyone nearby. The walls are collapsing all the time. Iron is flying. Glass windows are breaking. It's just mayhem and confusion. Firemen are doing the best they can to keep things under control, but they're really fighting a losing battle until the fire burns itself out.
OK, Peter, thank you. Peter McCarthy on the scene of a huge factory warehouse fire in Redfern this afternoon.
Sure.
And a small hospital. Is that the fire seems to be spreading, which is a big worry when you consider the population density of this area. We're having reports come through all the time. The latest word is that a fire has caught hold in the 9th floor of a block of flats occupied by pensioners. Now that's of great concern because the building itself is 18 floors high. Now we've heard some very large explosions in the past few minutes. We believe that's a plastics factory behind the warehouse complex that you see behind you. We believe some very highly flammable liquid is stored there. Now, we believe also that a hospital has been evacuated. Patients and staff have been evacuated from that hospital. Once again, that's behind the warehouse that you see. Now, with that warehouse, I think I mentioned earlier that all of the workers have been accounted for, but apparently that isn't the case. There are still 3 workers that just haven't showed up, so we can only hope for the best there. Well, you'll be hearing from me a little later on, but for now, this is Trevor Borman at Redfern, returning you to the 7 National News Studio.
By 3:45, the streets were closed. With the stiff wind and the old warehouse, there was every chance that the fire would spread, and it did just that. The sky was soon black. Centre. Next to the old warehouse, more industrial sites. Across the road, massive high-rise home units, and across in the tight little streets, terrace homes. Brigades were brought in from everywhere as the fire strengthened. For the people battling it, there were dangers everywhere. In the residential streets, the debris burned. People ran for cover as their hair was set alight by flying embers. 16 stories up in the high-rise, the building was beginning to fill with smoke, and the fire had made its mark. After an hour of starting, the fire had spread. The falling walls took their toll too. The streets were a shambles.
Now for the very latest from the fire, we're crossing live to Tony Eastley, who's been covering the story since the fire started this afternoon.
Hello, Richard. For the first time today, there's some optimism that the fire is actually under control. Earlier in the day, it was absolute pandemonium around this Waterloo, Redfern area. The big building, the high-rise behind me, had to be evacuated. The building around it was starting to catch on fire. At one stage, firemen screeched up to the top of the level and played hoses on a balcony, which had caught alight. Terrace homes, they too had started to catch on fire. People on their roofs hosing them down. Well, the good thing is that those fires have all been put out. At the Rachel Forster home, the old people's home, the people are waiting outside on the lawns and in ambulances. The emergency officials have given out blankets to try and comfort the people. But although the fire's out, it still may be some time before this whole Waterloo Redfern area is open again to the public. Back to the studio.
Tony Eastley reporting live. The New Zealand Rugby Union...
in the last half hour, sir?
Well, Tim, the last half hour has seen things come slightly under control, more under control than they were earlier, but the resources here are still stretched to the limit. Firemen are still spraying water on the blaze from every possible direction. They're still using the aerial appliances. The official word now is that the Rachel Forster Hospital has been saved. The wall closest to where the fire was burning in that centre building has been severely scorched and burnt, and windows have been broken. And all 70 patients from the Rachel Forster Hospital have been evacuated. But the hospital itself, I'm told by fire officials, is structurally sound, although somewhat damaged. It's now also been revealed that the centre building, the one we weren't sure of its identity, was in fact a medical storehouse. That explains the explosions, the chemicals in there. The residents here, the several hundred of the residents who have been evacuated from the fire area, they all face a long night out in the cold, I think, because the firemen have no plans to let them back into the area until they're absolutely safe, things are under control, and that looks like being at least until midnight, if not the early hours of the morning.
OK, Peter, thank you. Peter McCarthy at the scene of the...
blaze that could have been Australia's worst fire disaster. The outbreak in the furniture warehouse at number 52 Phillip Street was in itself one of the most severe fires Sydney has seen, but an even more threatening situation developed as the fire swept across the street to a 16-storey block of Housing Commission flats. Police and firemen are happy at the speed of yesterday's evacuation. There was little confusion, little panic. And that's gratifying when even firemen admit their efforts to contain the fire were futile.
At one stage, it was almost one of helplessness because the fire didn't seem to respond to anything we did for a while.
This is what firemen were especially concerned about. Sparks and flaming debris from the main warehouse fire wafting across the homes and units in this heavily populated suburb. The spot fire started on a 9th floor balcony of the neighbouring block. Firemen raced to locate the unit and extinguish the fire before it spread. 2 hours after the blaze started and the fire was still spreading in the northern side. A plastics factory caught fire, sending enormous fireballs 100 metres into the air. Then the second main evacuation just next door at the Rachel Forster Hospital. As flames melted the facade, 40 patients were evacuated and taken to other Sydney hospitals. Patients are back today and the Housing Commission tenants at home, but police and fire crews haven't started to examine the cause of the fire. The smouldering remains are still too hot to approach, the walls too unsafe to go near. Crushed cars remain in the streets and fire chiefs face the inevitable comparisons with other experiences.
Probably only the Buckingham's fire in 1968 and Hale Street Botany would have been equal to this one.
There were no deaths last night, not even serious injuries. That must serve as a tribute to our emergency services. Number 52 Phillip Street, the Exorcist building, will be bulldozed later this week. Trevor Borman for 7 National News.
24 blazes in Sydney in the past decade. Hundreds of people were evacuated after a furniture warehouse went up. Damage is expected to be in the millions. The cause of the massive fire may never be known.
It began around 4 yesterday afternoon as a shower of electrical sparks on the 3rd floor of a furniture warehouse. Within minutes, it seemed the gates of hell had opened in the heart of Redfern as flames engulfed the building, spreading with astonishing speed to an adjoining pharmaceutical warehouse. Punctuated by deafening blasts from exploding drums of chemicals, huge tongues of flame leapt 30 metres skywards, generating a deadly shower of fiery brands. Emergency services were suddenly grappling with a disaster of awesome proportions.
Right back to you. I want to get more firefighters in here.
Next door, the Rachel Forster Hospital caught fire, but evacuation was already underway. 150 patients, some just out of theatre, were whisked off to nearby hospitals.
We proceeded to evacuate the visitors and the patients from the floor, with a little bit of reluctance at first, but they certainly came calmly, and within about half an hour actually we moved all walking patients, all visitors, and then we proceeded to move the beds.
200 metres south, 600 Housing Commission tenants poured into the street as monstrous tongues of flame licked at the top 3 floors of the 16-storey tower. Directly opposite the inferno, hundreds more were evacuated as a storm of fireballs threatened terrace houses and live power lines arced around the pavements. Firemen fought a holding operation until dawn revealed a smouldering brick-strewn ruin, the remains of some 10 separate businesses. For the owners, heartbreak, and some soul-searching over the possible cause.
We were very careful with smoking and everything like that. There was no smoking allowed in the factory, except if a man was stationary at his post. So I know that it wasn't negligence on behalf of our people.
Damage is estimated in the millions. The hospital is expected to be back in operation tomorrow. This afternoon, residents began moving back into the area as workmen completed the fire's destruction in the interests of public safety. When the dust finally settles on a disaster of such proportions, there's very little to be thankful for. But one thing, according to firemen, is that the blaze didn't happen today. In wind such as this, would have been back.
Tonight, a breakthrough in the Greenpeace sinking. President Reagan suffering from cancer. And the federal government moves against the BLF. Good evening and welcome to the National for Tuesday, July the 16th.
In other news tonight, the new Liberal Party president fails to rule out a challenge to Andrew Peacock. Reports of a diplomatic post for former ALP Secretary David Coombe, and Sydney firemen may never know the cause of last night's multi-million-dollar fire. Hundreds of residents and patients at a nearby hospital were evacuated as the flames threatened to spread to other streets in the inner suburb of Waterloo. Now, although no one was injured, damage is expected to run into millions of dollars.
It wasn't just a furniture warehouse. Instead, the building housed a host of different businesses: Paddy Pallen's camping wear, a printing area, a ski repair shop and many others.
Well, it's known as a rabbit warren, so that'll give you an idea just what like it is. That's what it is known as.
There wasn't much left of it at first light. The 4-storey warehouse, sections of which were vacant and up for lease, was all but destroyed. 2 witnesses said they saw flames start on the top floor in the furniture section. One of them heard an explosion.
So there's a loud bang and there's smoke coming out of the top storey of the furniture warehouse place.
Fire officials said last night and today that it was one of the biggest fires in Sydney for some years. It caused the evacuation of hundreds of people, many of them elderly, from high-rise units and a nearby hospital. For most of them, it was good to be back home.
Very pleased, yeah.
Get back home, eh?
Yes. Thanks very much.
The owners of these cars had little to celebrate, though. In all, 4 vehicles and 2 trucks were caught in the fire or buried beneath falling brickwork. What didn't come down last night in the fire was knocked down by demolition people today. So far, the cause of the fire hasn't been pinpointed.